Present day. Present time. We live in a world where video games are a part of pop culture like they've never been before. What used to be a hobby deemed for nerds is now part of our lives, and is inching closer to other forms of media entertainment. However, this popularization has also changed the way games are made. Developers now have a much wider target audience, so most products need to meet a certain criteria just so every single person can play and enjoy them. This, however, has led to a bizarre feeling of stagnation around the medium. Making games is expensive, so big developers often choose to stick to something that previously worked to make sure that profits will arrive after shipping the game around the globe. So then, in this world of familiarity and security, you might ask, who will be daring enough to try something new? The answer is independent developers. Undertale, Shovel Knight, Celeste, The Binding of Isaac. There are countless examples of indie games nowadays. To many, their quirkiness and unique essence stands out even more among the rest of the market, me included. But interestingly, indie games have not been around for as long as you might think. Or at least, not in the way they are perceived today. Thing is, there was a turning point during the mid-2000s. And all because one game, developed by one person, suddenly broke through all of the barriers, catapulting itself into the spotlight. On the 20th of December 2004, Cave Story was released to the world. If you're watching this video upon release, that is about 20 years ago. Okay, editor BurnCrow here, so my idea was to release this video on the 20th of December, but a ton of things happened and I had to delay the video. So anyways, let's continue. 2 decades since indie video games changed forever. This is going to be an atypical video from my side, when it comes to structure at least. I believe that Cave Story is not a video game that can be separated into chunks, like any traditional review would do. So instead, let me take you on a journey to rediscover this experience together while dissecting its more intricate aspects. My name is BurnCrowSP, and I hope you are comfy at the other side of the screen, because I'm about to dive in. Allow me to start from the very beginning. Cave Story is a game that belongs in the action platformer genre. You, the player, will take control of a mute character called Quote, who awakens inside of a cave with no prior memories, and who will soon find himself embarking on an adventure across the insides of a floating island. Along the way, you'll have to jump and shoot through many different areas, while collecting various new weapons, upgrading your character to reach new locations, and watching the story unfold upon your eyes. But before we get into any of that, Cave Story needs to teach you about its rules, and the first cave is here to do just that. Since Quote wakes up without any abilities other than jumping and moving left and right, the first screen is like a small testing ground to give you a quick idea of how controlling your character feels like. The real deal, however, starts out as soon as you step through the door. Here you're given 2 choices. In most side-scrollers, the right path is the way to go, but if you follow your instincts, you'll quickly find yourself in front of your first enemy. You're unable to fight them at this point, so you might as well betray your previous knowledge and pick the other option. If you manage to progress downwards into the cave, you shall find the very first health capsule, instantly upgrading the defenses of your character. The placement of this item is not accidental. It's here not only to mark the equator of your progress to this area, but to tell you, hey, you're doing fine. Up next, Cave Story proceeds to teach you about how to properly utilize your ability to jump. These flying enemies are designed to have a consistent timing, so they are pretty good opponents against the floatiness of Quote's hops. Despite this, he's not floaty underwater, which is the last lesson you'll learn before finding the end of the tutorial. Through this door, you'll find the Polar Star, your initial weapon, and this is where the game starts taking off the wheels. Once you leave, you'll notice how there are more enemies now, which is perfect to try out your new and shiny gun. Through this, you'll learn about one of the main gimmicks that Cave Story is designed around, which is weapon levels. Every weapon in this game can be upgraded up to 3 times by picking up these shiny particles that drop from enemies. What makes it really interesting is that these power-ups are not permanent. If you take damage, you will not only lose HP, but weapon power too, and you can even lose levels. This mechanic defines the way Cave Story is played. At max level, most weapons are very powerful, however, to hold on to your capabilities, careful play is required, meaning that instead of going guns blazing like in most games of the genre, you really gotta think about how to approach each obstacle. Once you make your way back up, you can now exit through the jumpscare door, and here's where the game truly begins. Although, what makes this stage so brilliant is that in about 2 or 3 minutes of playtime, you've been told about your character's physics, weapon levels, how your character reacts to multiple environments, and basic notions like the importance of exploration, all without a single line of text. If this way of designing a level sounds familiar, it's because it's a combination of how Super Mario Bros. And Metroid tried to both have their players learn and subvert their own expectations. In fact, there are many elements of Cave Story that are inspired by 80s good game design convention. For example, the reason why Quote uses red and white on his outfit is so he can pop out against dark backgrounds, which was also the reason why Mario wears the same shade of red. As to why the game is this way, we need to talk about its one and only developer. Daisuke Amaya, also known by his nickname Pixel, developed Cave Story on his free time over the span of 5 years. While he had already published 3 games at the time of Cave Story's release, this time he wanted to create something reminiscent of the games he played as a child. Born in the late 70s, Pixel saw the rise of the first big home consoles at an early age, which means that those games we just pointed out when talking about the first Cave are precisely what he grew up with. But his way of approaching game creation goes beyond just a few inspirations. In an interview aired on the Nintendo channel back in 2010, he explained how the first steps he took during the development of Cave Story was creating the title screen and programming basic character movements. He wanted to make sure that the game was fun to play before getting into actual level and enemy design. Pixel has always been very open about his methodical approach as a designer, and you'll see me quote many of his public statements as we discuss different aspects of the game. That said, the wheels are off, and it's time to make our grand entrance into the next area. Welcome to Mimiga Town! This place, unlike the first cave, is completely safe, and it's inhabited by, well, the Mimigas. These small creatures, which somewhat resemble the appearance of a bunny, are the local residents of the island. Those 2 characters we just saw having an argument are King, the leader of this town, and Toroko, sister of the legendary Mimiga hero Arthur. By talking to King, however, you'll soon learn that the town isn't as calm as it may seem. Someone named the Doctor has been kidnapping Mimigas for unknown reasons, which explains why only a few of these fellows remain here. After this dialogue is over, you're free to explore the town, and I like how Cave Story switches to a short exploration segment so early into the game. If you didn't get the basics of how to control Quote, this is the perfect time for it. In fact, you can make use of what you've learned to obtain the map, which will certainly become a helpful tool across the entire journey. The other reason why I believe this is a great idea is because it's the perfect opportunity to kickstart the main plot. I didn't mention it earlier, but Cave Story opens with a short cutscene that shows a man inside of an almost empty room, as he's trying to contact a person named Sue. You'll see him again as you leave the first cave, as he gets more and more comically desperate. Now, inside of Mimiga Town, there are a few places you can visit, and all of them will give you a small piece of lore to work with. Going in clockwise order, first of all, there's Yamashita Farm. Not only can you get another life capsule here, instantly rewarding you for your curiosity, but the farmer will give you a very important piece of trivia. Mimigas feed on flowers. However, there's a special kind of flower distinct by their red color that causes a bizarre burst of rage upon ingestion, killing the berserk Mimiga soon after. Right below is the cemetery, which is guarded by Jack, Kin's second in command and a professional pointer. He will not let you proceed into the other side of the door, since there is a plague of mushrooms apparently. Right below your spawn point is Mahin, Quote asks her about Sue, to which she replies, she must be looking for flying dragons. Wonder if that's really a thing. The last place you can check is the fishing pond, where you'll meet Kampachi, the fisher Mimiga. From him, you'll learn that this place is where Sue was first found. One day, she came from the waterway that hangs above the pond, but despite being one of their kind, she's not treated the same way. Now, aside from this ear-catching piece of lore, your eyes might also be pointing towards this shiny object down here. If you care to investigate, you'll find a silver pendant, shaped like a fish. With nothing else to see here, Quote heads towards the exit, when suddenly he crosses sights with Toroko once more. She immediately runs away though, bashing into King as she makes her escape. Leaving the reservoir, there are only two places left for you to check. One is Arthur's house, which is locked down at the time, leaving the small building over here as the last place you need to take a look at. And as it turns out, it's open. Inside, only silence awaits. What could possibly go wrong? That was quite the scare, wasn't it? Toroko seems very shaken about Quote's presence. Just like King moments before, she confuses him for an enemy. Apparently the doctor has been sending his goons to the village, taking away some of its citizens and even killing them, which is exactly what happened to Arthur. Speaking of the devil, these two are Balrog and Misery, the doctor's henchmen. You might recognize them from the title screen, but we'll get into that later on. Mistaking her for Sue, Misery takes Toroko away, leaving Balrog behind to clean up. Balrog seems bothered by this decision. In fact, he gives you the option to fight him or not, and it's up to you. This is the first of many times where you can make an impact over the course of the game's story, and I really appreciate how it's introduced this way. Fighting Balrog or not doesn't change much, so players will get a taste of the game's interactivity without any unforeseen consequences. You could say it's a story teaching element. Things are about to go down in town, however. With King seemingly gone, Quote walks up to Jack, who is understandably alarmed by Toroko's kidnapping. By doing so, on the other hand, you can now investigate the cemetery. And atop the grave of the legendary Arthur, you find the keys to his house, allowing you to enter that one place you couldn't get to before. This one screen is a great example of how to utilize the environment to drop hints to the player about the story. This was once Arthur's home, although according to Mahin, it's now occupied by Sue and Toroko, thus explaining the presence of a chalkboard and a computer. What's really interesting though is down here. These are, indeed, red flowers. If you've been listening to what Mahin and other villagers had to say about Arthur, you'll know that he died in battle against the Doctor. But now, these flowers tell a different story. Aside from the flowers, you can check the computer, where the last line of dialogue we saw from that person's transmission is being displayed. Along with it, you're given the chance to connect the teleporter to the egg corridor. And with nowhere else to go, Quote steps in. The egg corridor is the first proper level of Cave's story. During development, Pixel wanted to design every area around a specific idea or feeling. In the case of the egg corridor, that sensation was warmth, that being represented by the many giant eggs displayed across the place. Design-wise, this is a direct evolution of what we've seen thus far. The game even tests out if your skills are a match for your curiosity, by placing a nifty upgrade right alongside a very dangerous enemy. And this doesn't come out of nowhere. This small robot here will make sure to warn you about it. As for its layout, it's a corridor, which means you'll be following a straight line while fighting various enemies along the way. Just because it's a corridor, it doesn't mean that there aren't any nooks to explore and crannies to investigate. First of them is Cthulhu's abode, where this very bizarre character resides. His dialogue, though, is something that will surely pique your interest. Hey, this is highly unusual. You're a soldier from the surface, are you not? Where's your blonde pal? Oh, you lost your memory? Up until this point, the identity of Quote himself has been a point of interest for multiple characters. The Mimiga seems scared of him, and now the cloaked weirdo recognizes him as a soldier from the surface. But what about the blonde pal? You'll have to investigate further, it seems. In fact, if you continue upwards, you can find another health upgrade. As you take our robotic, cap-wearing fellow through the corridor, you'll eventually run into the next cutscene. Seems like not all Mimigas are small and cute. In fact, this one is pretty aggressive too. Quote quickly follows him, but his progress is halted by the presence of a barrier. This is the second and last puzzle you'll need to figure out to complete this area, and the solution is pretty clever. Earlier in the area, you have probably run into the egg monitoring room, where you can check the state of every single egg in the corridor. From here, you'll notice how eggs number 1 and 6 have faced some issues. If you go and check these two, you'll get the ID card to open up the barrier, and inside of egg 1, there's a terminal where you need to use it. Alongside this small mission, you can check this chest up here to obtain your second weapon, the missile launcher, a limited yet powerful piece of equipment. Something worth noting is how the egg corridor eases players into the gameplay loop that Cave Story is going to make use of in the upcoming levels. Running and gunning is not enough, you need to pay attention to your surroundings too, and these first proper puzzles are very intuitive. They may seem like minor details, but stuff like the terminals lighting up in red as you go by them, or how this hell capsule leads you into talking to this NPC, are very good ways of catching the player's attention. Combine this with a progressively challenging platforming, and you've got yourself a very well designed level. As for the boss fight that awaits you at the end, Igor will be your opponent. Since the fight against Balrog at Mimiga Town is technically optional, this will be the first boss for some players, and so he's designed to be simple. With only a jump and a launch, any player can identify his attack patterns and dispatch the Berserk Mimiga in seconds. This is also a good time to put that missile launcher to use, in case you haven't already. Now, at the other side of the door, Quote finally finds Sue, who asks if we saved her. She seems bothered by any of the two responses, immediately shouting that she hates this island and everything living on it. That is why she wants to hatch egg number 0 and use the sleeping dragon to escape the island. Still, a password is required to activate the hatching process, and only her brother knows about it. So, Quote makes a deal with Sue. She will allow him to leave the island on her dragon, but only if he helps her in return. What's interesting though, is that once again, she mentions how our robotic protagonist is not from here, since the letters on his cap are not in Mimiga language. With Sue leaving the area, the player is tasked with playing through the corridor backwards, on their way to the teleporter that took them here. On a first playthrough, this is a nice chance to take a second look around the place, and grab any goods that you might have missed. Sure, you're backtracking, but you can get to the opposite end of the corridor in less than 3 minutes, so it's not that big of a deal. As soon as Quote returns, however, he runs into bad news. Despite being able to contact her brother, our newfound ally has been imprisoned by King, who intends to offer her to the doctor in exchange for Toroko. In this dire situation, the player becomes her only hope, sending Quote into a mission to the Bushlands, while she tries to reason with the leader of the Mimigas. And so we are off to the next area, the Bushlands, also known as Grasstown. This is easily one of the most recognizable places in the entire game. For many players, this is where Cave Story really kicks off, and that's for a good reason, as we will see in a moment. As soon as Quote arrives, however, he meets a Mimiga named Santa, who asks if we can bring back the keys of his own house, since he dropped them on his way back. The key is not far from the starting point, so it's more like a warm-up for what's coming up later. Something very funny about Santa's house is the fact that he has instant death spikes in his basement. It's a very cheeky way of straight up telling the player about their existence, and it always makes me smile. What will surely make you smile too is that by talking to Santa, he'll give you a new weapon, the Fireball, as a way to thank you for helping him earlier. He also warns Quote that to make it deep into the lands, he'll need to get through Chaco's fireplace. Alright, now that we are here, I think it's impossible to avoid talking about the presentation. Cave Story uses a visual style reminiscent of NES games, utilizing for the most part solid, simple backgrounds but with ever-changing tilesets that gives every area a unique visual identity. Considering how the setting of the game is based around the insides of a floating island, managing to create these many places while maintaining a consistent art style is quite the achievement. But if there is something that Cave Story is remembered for, is for its soundtrack. Just like everything else in the game, it was composed and arranged solely by Pixel. In fact, he designed his own software to program every track and feed them into the game. Talk about dedication. I mention this now because the piece that accompanies the Bushlands went on to become one of the most recognizable tunes in video game history, and for good reason. Not only is it catchy, but it gives you that adventurous feel of heading into the unknown. While I'm not an expert in music theory or anything, one thing I really love about this track is how it has a sense of progression, thanks to how the instruments slowly join in until the song feels complete. It's like a representation of the area itself, since it starts out with some familiar enemies, and it soon becomes a crowded place where you'll have to put all of your current arsenal to the test. I'll come back to rambling about music and graphics later down the road, but for now, let's continue onwards. As I said, Bushlands starts out as a very combat-heavy area, with stronger versions of past enemies making their entrance. It's also the perfect introduction to the Fireball weapon, since it's the best way to make use of the sloped terrain. I never thought about it until I was writing this script, but this weapon is probably a reference to Super Mario Bros. As well. Now, not too far in, Quote finds Chaco's house. Just like Santa mentioned, the only way to progress further is by passing through her fireplace. To do so, on the other hand, you'll need some jellyfish juice to put away the flames. Similarly to the first cave, from now on, the Bushlands will hold these jellyfish enemies. Aim for the big fellow and you'll get your key to make it past the fireplace. But that's not all. While the early sections of the Bushlands are pretty similar to what the game has been offering thus far, this single item makes for a few interesting puzzles. If you pay attention to its description, it reads, "a fluid that can quench fireplaces." Thing is, if you have a very curious eye, you might have checked other fireplaces up until this point, like the one inside of the assembly hall or Santa's house. Both will give you a different message, hinting at something being surrounded by flames. And yeah, you guessed it right, you can indeed use jellyfish juice on both of these. Santa's fireplace will give you some nice charcoal, which will soon come in handy, and the one at the assembly hall hides a new weapon, the Bushlands. The first of many secret tools hidden across the island. And now that Quote has more power at his disposal, is when the leveling up mechanic starts to really shine. Each one of these tools can be very powerful by themselves, yet they still serve multiple purposes thanks to how they function, and especially the way they upgrade. All weapons have 3 levels, sure, but the amount of experience they need heavily varies between them, and so does their resistance to damage. This gives each firearm a very different identity, because it adds a strategic value to each one of them. As a quick example, at max level, the Bushlands becomes this wide-range machine gun that creates bubbles around Quote, not only acting as a shield, but also as a powerful blast when you finally release the fire button. However, to compensate, the Bushlands is extremely fragile, and it will level down sooner than weapons like the Fireball or the Polar Star. Even better, Cave Story lets you change weapons at the press of a button, allowing you to do stuff like, let's say, destroying enemies with the Polar Star, then changing to the Fireball to pick up the experience points. If you're fast enough, you can even swap weapons in a pinch, just so your preferred option doesn't take the blow. A system like this elevates the skill ceiling to a whole new level. Expert players will know when and how to use each tool, and how to properly take care of them. Back to Chaco's house, you can now proceed to the other side, and this is where those instant death spies come into play. The second half of the Bushlands introduces new obstacles, like fake floors, which are masterfully showcased to the player, and a new enemy in the form of Manon. This is the first opponent that makes you really think about your actions, since they will fire a powerful blast every time you hit them, discouraging reckless play. The game will delve deeper into this dynamic later into the area, and I really like how Pixel used them in multiple setups. Like here, where you have a normal enemy sandwiched between Manons, demanding careful aiming. It's here, however, where you'll find this pretty big building. By checking its door, you learn that it's locked. But then, this happens. Seems like it wasn't as empty as it seems. The person inside politely asks Quote for help, since the door only opens from the outside, thus handing him a very rusty key. Well, that should be easy. Well, I guess we'll have to take the more violent approach and blow up that piece of junk. As to how, well, that is something you're gonna have to figure out by yourself. While this may seem very intimidating with how little clues you're given this time, this is one of the more ingenious puzzles in the game. If you pay attention to your surroundings, you'll probably notice the various fans, which are scattered across the area. Fans that also seem like the only way to reach quite a few doors. Since every other place leads to an upgrade or an immediate reward of some kind, it's likely to come to the conclusion that there must be a way to activate these somehow. The solution ends up being a few steps back. It's there that you can find the power supply room, where you can use that rusty key you were given earlier. Okay, there we go, fan power on. Oh, wait, Malco power on too. Okay, load your pipes, it's time to go ham! We see each other again, huh? Balrog comes back to tell you that, yeah, they kidnapped the wrong Mimiga, and the doctor was upset enough to give Misery a beatdown. Yet despite acknowledging his discomfort with his master's actions, obeying him is their fate. Thus he's here to fight Quote, this time for real. And he has a new trick up his sleeve. It's a pretty easy encounter still, but good enough for a mini-boss. Speaking of Balrog, I've always found it funny how his portrait only shows his right eye. He's like too big for one of those. And now with him making a retreat, maybe you should check up on that poor robot. Turns out he's not evil at all, he was just doing his job. And since Quote helped him to get back to his usual height, he wants to do something for him in return. And would you look at that, he can create explosives. That is 2 problems solved in just one sweep. To craft the bomb, however, you'll need to bring him 3 specific items: charcoal, jellyfish juice, and gum base. 2 of those are directly linked to the earlier parts of the Bushlands, since you get the charcoal from Santa's fireplace and the jellyfish juice from the jellies. As for the gum base, if you go back to the fellow behind the door, you'll receive a key with the label gum that must lead to somewhere. By elimination, the only locked door in the area is the one at the very end of the Bushlands, now within Quote's reach thanks to the fans being activated. This series of jumps can be very tricky since the last one is definitely tight, and messing up can lead to an instant kaboom. Thankfully, there's a save point right before this part, so it's fine if you can't get it on the first try. Oh, and on the topic of save point, despite homaging old video games, Cave Story is surprisingly fair when it comes to its difficulty, and a big part of all of that is that it allows you to save pretty often. Just like in every Metroidvania, if you kick the bucket, you'll be sent back to the last point where you saved your progress. Every area in the game has a bunch of these, often placed right before a difficult section or a boss fight. It's amazing that the game is this lenient because not only is it a very sensible decision from a game design standpoint, but it also allows Pixel to create some difficult challenges without catching people off guard. You'll learn to trust these floppy disks, and that's a great thing. Once you finally make it up there though, Quote will find himself facing Misery. Just like many characters up to this point, she recognizes the protagonist as a soldier from the surface. What's very interesting in this case is what she says right afterwards. Before the conversation develops any further, Balrog steps in. I suppose there's no other way to escape from this than to fight the flying toaster once again. Except Misery is gonna give him a power-up on this occasion, transforming him into the almighty Balrog. Jokes aside, Balrog is a much bigger opponent than anything Quote has faced thus far. His pattern though is very comprehensive. Balrog jumps across the room, dropping smaller frogs onto the arena, and once he reaches the corner, he'll open his mouth to shoot a barrage of projectiles. His mouth is also the only weak spot, so the fight has two clear phases. It's like you and Balrog are taking turns. What makes it really engaging is that this fight wants you to use everything you've learned thus far. Fans become a necessary tool to jump over Balrog, and to properly damage him, you'll need to use your weapons accordingly. Like taking out the little frogs with a polar star, then using the missiles to fire at his mouth. It's a very well-rounded boss fight that's also really darn fun to learn and master, as any proper boss fight needs to be. With Balrog defeated, Quote has now the gun base in his possession, and with all three materials ready, you can now give them to Malco to craft a bomb. Set it off in front of the door and voila! Mission accomplished. The person trapped inside is none other than Kazuma Sakamoto. He tells Quote that he tried to escape from the doctor's clutches, but unfortunately he ended up trapping himself inside here. Alright, it's time to go back to Mimiga Village and take him to Sue. Except something happens. This is Professor Booster, an ally of Kazuma and another human that has been hiding from the doctor. After that silent exchange though, he brings bad news. The doctor has begun gathering the Mimigas, which is what we saw back at the village, since he has found a way to obtain the red flowers. As we already know, these are lethal to the Mimigas, but before their demise they become extremely powerful rabbit monsters. Both reach the conclusion that he must be stopped before the war begins, so they decide to meet back at Arthur's house to trace a plan along with Sue. Booster wants us to come along too, and as they part on their turbo bike, it's time for us to make our way back to the teleporter. I find it very funny how right before the exit, you can see the bike, or well, what remains of it. And if you interact with it, Quote says, "The motorbike Kazuma was driving, it's not looking so hot anymore." This fellow has a good sense of humor when he wants to. The moment you touch the teleporter, the game shows you what's happening at the other side, as Quote is being transported to Arthur's house. While we were trying to rescue Kazuma, Sue was able to talk her way out of the cell, finally making King understand the situation. One detail about the dialogue I really appreciate is how Sue labels King as a friend of mine. Considering how these people have been treating each other all of this time, this tells you a lot about her character. And, thankfully, we'll see more of those moments later on. Now that the entire crew has gathered, it's time to come up with a plan to stop the doctor before he gets a chance to get his hands on the red flowers. According to Booster, these are hidden away at some place inside of the Sand Zone, one of the most dangerous areas of the island. That last bit of info is the reason why Quote is the key component of the plan. Booster wants him to enter the Sand Zone, make his way to the place where red flowers blossom, and burn those petals to a crisp before the doctor arrives. He also confirms a very important piece of lore about the main character. Turns out, yes indeed, he's a scout robot, sent to the island 10 years in the past. But again, it's rare that any of them survived, which means Quote might be the only survivor. That, however, is about to be proven wrong. Okay, that said, the journey is going to get very rocky from this point onward, so why don't we take a short breather before diving into the arid landscape of the Sand Zone. In fact, this is your last chance to leave the video before I dive into big spoilers, so it might be the perfect time to tell you about how and where you can play Cave Story. What you've seen on screen thus far is the original 2004 Windows release, commonly known as the freeware or vanilla version of Cave Story. You can find this at Pixel's own website or over at the Cave Story tribute site. Back then, the game was only released in Japanese. But just a month later, the Eon Genesis team arrived with a translation patch, thus kicking off the game's popularity overseas. The localization patch is honestly amazing, and to many it's still the preferred way to enjoy Cave Story. However, the freeware edition has a few quirks that might put off some players. To begin with, controller support is very finicky with modern devices, so you're probably gonna have to stick with a keyboard. To me that's perfectly fine, in fact I recorded all of this footage playing on one, but I can see why that might bother some of you. Another weakness of this version is that its frame rate is locked at 50 frames per second, or rather 50 Hz. In an interview with Destructoid back in 2010, Pixel was asked about this decision, and he replied, "At the time, there were lots of PC setups that weren't able to reach 60 frames per second. There were computers that could set the refresh rate to the program, but others where you couldn't. Most computers were at a refresh rate slightly higher than 60 FPS. When that happened, the periodical scroll of the screen shook erratically, and this affected the game experience, which I didn't like. In the end, I made it 50 FPS because there were no environments with that rate. So, regardless of where it's running, there would be no adverse issues." That said, future versions of Cave Story will change that, allowing the game to run smoothly at 60 frames per second. Those first re-releases of Cave Story came around 6 years later, developed by Nicolis for the Nintendo Wii and Nintendo DSi, and made available through their online shop services. The Wii version introduced quite a few changes to the experience, like a revised localization, a new soundtrack, increased resolution, and a few extra game modes. Being the first time that Cave Story had made its way into a console, it was a pretty big shock online. However, this port also garnered some very valid criticism. To begin with, many didn't like the new localization, and especially the new soundtrack. As a matter of fact, the original US release arrived with some very noticeable problems regarding the audio. Interestingly, one user under the name of Morus-K posted a comment on the TIG forum about Cave Story, where he said the following: "Hello, I've worked on the music for Cave Story. As you've all noticed, there's a lot of weird things going on with the audio. For instance, drum tracks not playing, instrument changes delayed, unbalanced mixing. I discovered this yesterday by watching Let's Play videos, and I'm as disappointed as you. Niklas and me have been asking many times for being able to soundcheck the game, but that's not really something we had control over. Of course, the music is still questionable, but I just want to say a few words about it, since people start to associate us with all of the audio oddities in that game. That's quite embarrassing, especially because I feel like we've done the job seriously, considering limitations we had and time we spent sorting them out. On the upside now, I talked to Tyron yesterday, and he said something about updating the game when the European version is uploaded, so you may also hope for a Balrog dialogue change. That update did come at the same time as the European version, just a few months later. Whether you like it or not, the Wii version allows players to use the original graphics and music, so no problems there. My biggest issue though is how the audio balancing is a bit all over the place if you use default settings. Aside from that, it's a pretty good port. The DSi version, on the other hand, made use of the console capabilities, allowing you to interact with the menu by using the bottom screen. While the new graphics and soundtrack are not present here, the new translation is. It's pretty cool to see the game running on a portable console without any performance issues whatsoever. The camera's behavior was also adapted to make up for the smaller screen size, which is a very nice touch. Just like the Wii version though, there are some funny things going on with the audio. But it's not bad enough to damage your experience that much. Sadly, since online services for these two consoles are gone nowadays, the only way you can experience them is through the chunky DS and the big Wii. That wouldn't be the last time Cave Story would hop into the portable market, because just a year later, it would receive a complete remake in the form of Cave Story 3D, being one of the first titles to join the Nintendo 3DS library. It added a lot of new content, like new levels designed by Pixel, redesigned areas, and a complete revamped visual style that isn't really my cup of tea, to be honest. Sound-wise though, the new soundtrack courtesy of Danny Baranowski is pretty amazing, using higher quality samples to craft a more updated sound to match the in-game visuals. These tracks, along with the updated dialogue, graphics, and extra modes, would then be ported back to PC a few weeks later, in the form of Cave Story Plus. To this day, this is easily the best way to play the 2004 classic. It allows you to mix and match graphics and music settings, it includes every bit of extra content except the level design changes of Cave Story 3D, and if you're playing on Switch, it even adds 2-player co-op and a rendition of the OST by Rush Yet 1, which was conceived under the limitations of the NES sound chip. There are also a few non-official versions of the game, like Cave Story for the freaking Sega Genesis, which is something that still leaves me baffled. It runs really darn well too, while making just a few compromises in the process. The developer behind this port must be a magician or something. That said, I think Cave Story Plus is the perfect entry point if you're willing to pay for the game. And in case you wanna try it out before opening your wallet, you can go for the freeware or Wii versions. Alrighty, that said, if you got to this point and you haven't played Cave Story just yet, please do it. And I hope I gave you enough reasons to convince you. And to those who have either beaten the game already or just want to watch the full thing, thank you very much for sticking with me thus far. Now let's get back to the show. The plan is clear. Enter the sand zone, find the flowers, and destroy them before the Doctor can use them for his schemes. Yet, as soon as Quote arrives, a very peculiar character appears. Is that the blonde pal the Cthulhu guy was talking about? Only way to find out is to proceed forward, or rather upwards. This first area is a small love letter to Metroid, resembling one of the vertical shafts of Brinstar. It definitely put a smile on my face the first time I arrived here. At the top, Quote finds a bar, and at the other side of the door, there she is. Oh well, I guess we are having a western movie moment here. Despite this fight being pretty short, she can be pretty tough to deal with on your first go. Her machine gun deals a lot of damage, and the Mimigas can block your shots if you're not careful. With good timing on your jumps though, it shouldn't give you too much trouble. Being kinda like a mirror match, I think it's a fun encounter. After defeating her, it turns out this is all a small misunderstanding. This fellow is Curly Brace, another scout robot that survived whatever happened 10 years ago. She's been raising and protecting this Mimiga since they were children, and just like Quote, her memory was gone upon awakening. Now that things have calmed down, you can talk to the other Mimigas inside the bar, and it's from them that you'll learn how to make progress inside this place. Apparently, there is an old woman named Jenka who can tell you more about the red flowers. To get to her though, you must take the puppy inside Curly's room with you. This room, however, hides a small Easter egg. If you check your map, you can see that there is a hidden path over the ceiling. Get far enough to the right, press down, and... you pervy robot! This item is completely useless, by the way, it's just a funny secret. There's another one of these Easter eggs back at the Bushlands. If you sleep on Chaco's bed, she will fall asleep by your side, and her lipstick will be secretly added to your inventory. Oh well, it seems like Mega Man Ballnut finally has a proper rival, if you know what I mean. With no way to progress downward, the Mimigas tell Quote that there must be a way to activate the sandstones that are blocking the path, and so a robotic fellow makes his way into the deep chambers of the sand zone. If the corridor's theme was warmth, sand zone represents oppression, with tight corridors and enemies designed to overwhelm you. I do like how you're forced to stay away from the ground, since most patches of sand hide giant crocodiles that will immediately try to chomp you the moment you land. So the level design forces you to work around that by creating your own places to stand on, thus demanding careful shooting and precise platforming. It's like playing a game of The Floor is Lava, except you're Anakin Skywalker. Despite these very clear ideas, I believe the Sand Zone is the place that will make or break your enjoyment of Cave Story, at least gameplay wise. Thing is, while the design for this place is easy to understand, the execution is a bit sloppy for a few reasons. First of all, you can completely cheese half of the initial section by entering the secret path, completely invalidating most of the challenge. You could argue that it's supposed to be a cheeky bonus, and while that is true, it's so easy to find that it might as well not be a secret. Not only does the save point indicate that there must be a way to get up there, but there's also this specific tile that sticks out with the rest of the scenery. On top of it, the boss at the end of this section, Omega, is surprisingly easy. He only has a few slow, easy to read attacks, and his weak spot stays open for long periods of time. The combination of these factors makes a little bit of a mess on the difficulty curve, because after the progressive increase in challenge we've seen so far, the Sand Zone is a linear, platforming heavy path that you can completely ignore, followed by a boss that's miles simpler than the last few encounters. The big deal breaker, however, is what follows soon after. Once you've beaten Omega, if you return to the start, the sandstones will now be open, revealing a path downward. The lower half of the Sand Zone completely discards the initial idea of overwhelming the player, opting instead for designing challenges based around heavy combat and precision platforming. While pretty good in its own right, the problem isn't in the design itself, but the main objective that this place is based around. To clear the Sand Zone, you must find 4 puppies and take them back to the house at the beginning of this section. These are found in a variety of ways, like inside of a treasure chest, a hidden darkened room, or at the very end of the area. Problem is, you can only carry one at a time. This forces the player to walk across the same place multiple times, which can become a bit tedious after a while, and especially on subsequent playthroughs. At that point, once you know where to find each puppy, it becomes a cycle of find dog, solve puzzle, walk back to the entrance, repeat. And I think the reason why this feels so dry compared to other similar quests throughout the story is the fact that the Sand Zone remains the same. Let's take the Bushlands as an example. Back there, you also had to progress through one single area multiple times, but in that case, every time you are forced to revisit something, there is something new to spice things up, first the jellies and then the fans. Here, nothing will change as you find the dogs, so it can indeed feel a tad repetitive. The fact that these two sections of the story are almost played back to back doesn't help either. It's a very unfortunate situation too, because from this point onward, the game starts to really shine. On the contrary, while the gameplay might feel a bit repetitive during this chapter of Cave Story, at the same time, the story really starts to take off. Let's rewind back for a second. Before fighting Omega, Quote runs into misery once more, which means that the race to find the red flowers is already on. The reason why you've been carrying that puppy from earlier is because the warehouse where the flowers are hidden is locked down, and the guardian for that key is none other than Jenka. As Quote engages in conversation with her for the first time, Balrog enters the scene. Our soap bar fellow wants to take the key to the warehouse, something that the old lady refuses to do, prompting Balrog to call her a traitor. She will then send you to find her puppies, which you'll be forced to do in hopes of convincing her to give you the key. The really interesting aspect of this whole chapter is how for every puppy you retrieve, Jenka will tell you more about the nature of this island as well as the red flowers. Turns out, 10 years ago, a battalion of combat robots, just like Quote, arrived at the island for unknown purposes and began attacking the local folk. To try and fight back against the nefarious machines, the Mimigas consumed the red flowers, in a desperate attempt to become strong enough to defend themselves. This resulted in a massive tragedy, with countless Mimigas losing their lives. It is also rumored that some of those berserk Mimigas managed to make their way to the surface, where humans live, taking away innocent lives in the process. This is the reason why the flowers were sealed away, and why the Doctor must not gain access to them at all costs. After bringing the third puppy, Jenka reveals to Quote that she will not give him the key to the warehouse, since that would invite that same tragedy all over again. Despite her words, Quote recovers the last puppy and makes his way back to Jenka's hut. However, as he crosses the door, he realizes it's too late. Balrog has taken a more violent approach and stolen the key by force. Knowing this, Jenka begs for our protagonist to quickly make his way to the warehouse since the doctor will soon arrive, and then everything will be over. And so he does, fighting through the arid landscapes of the Sand Zone one last time. Despite his efforts, the door to the warehouse is already open by the time Quote arrives, and inside, the turning point of Cave Story's plot is about to take place. Up to this moment, we've heard many things about the Doctor from various characters. He's been portrayed as this diabolical man who does not hesitate in taking away innocent lives to fulfill his plans, and whose cruelty even reaches his own allies. All of this information is given to you as you play through the game, and so you'll probably create a pretty grim image of this character inside your imagination. So now it's time to meet him for real. The worst case scenario is now the reality. The Doctor has obtained the seeds of the demon flowers, and just to confirm your suspicions about his personality, he decides to test them right away on a real Mimiga. King suddenly enters the scene, sword in hand, quickly slashing Balrog and then preparing himself to attack the Doctor directly. Unfortunately, he is no match for Misery, who's quick to send him flying across the room. Then, Quote finally crosses through the door. However, it's too late. Quote is left to deal with what remains of Toroko, as the Doctor makes his escape. To make matters worse, despite King's valiant attempt, Balrog was successful in forcing a red flower down Toroko's throat, and she transforms into a giant berserk monster. If you're invested in the story, this fight feels horrible at a personal level. It's very cruel, especially if you take into account that this is a main story event, thus making it impossible to avoid. Rabbit Toroko as a boss fight is definitely on par with Balrog when it comes to difficulty. But what's really special about it is the atmosphere surrounding it. Up to this point, every opponent has been a monster summoned by either Misery or Balrog to stop you on your tracks. And, upon beating them, you get a small victory message accompanied by a jingle. However, in this case, this is what happens. That silence sent chills down my spine on my first playthrough. It's such a simple effect that it carries a huge impact. That wasn't a boss, that was your friend, and she is not moving anymore. And to make matters even worse, King is not gonna make it either. He passes away shortly after the fight, asking Quote to avenge him, leaving his sword behind, which is a new addition to the player's arsenal. Okay, that was quite a lot. Cave Story's narrative is something very special for a game like this. For the last few areas, the player has been allowed to progressively learn about the flowers, the Mimigas, and the Doctor's actions over them. Considering it takes about 90 minutes to get to this point, it's amazing how the game manages to set up its main antagonist in such an effective way. His design as a character is also pretty intimidating by default. He looks like an ordinary person, yet his supernatural abilities and unnerving expression tells you a very different story. He is also accompanied by this simple yet gloomy piece of music that perfectly defines his character. I know it might be a cliché thing to say, but it sounds like pure evil. This whole set of events is also a shocker for most players, especially considering how whimsical the game feels during the first hour of playtime. You wouldn't expect the story to get dark in such a brutal way, but the thing is, this is just the beginning. As soon as Quote steps out the door, he's ambushed by Misery and Balrog. After forcing us to clean up the results of the Doctor's quick experiment, they are going to send our main character right into the Labyrinth. What do you mean by that felt good? Girl, what's your problem? Quote wakes up inside of a dark room, but he's not alone this time. This is the Labyrinth, the trash heap of the island. A place that hides the darkest secrets of this land and that nobody has been able to escape from. We are here to change that though. According to this fellow robot, there is a switch at the top of the room that can open the doors. He tried to get there many times, but after so many attempts, he broke his legs. Man, poor guy, that's really freaking sad. This small section has a few teaching elements about gimmicks that will soon be thrown into the mix. Like these moving platforms that only activate when you are at a certain distance from them. I always die here a few times because Rabbit Toroko hits like a truck, and afterwards there is no way to heal until way later into the area. Nonetheless, once you get to the top, you can flip the switch and open up the doors. I like how you can see the other robots react to the fact that you finally allowed them to escape. Yet, as unfortunate as it may be, the moment you step through the door, you can see that they have been destroyed by this cockroach fellow. Mate, I tell you, this game knows how to play with your feelings. It's time to step back into the action because the Labyrinth is the toughest area we've seen thus far. And the difficulty gets summed up in very interesting ways, like placing enemies in spots that require you some clever thinking to take them down. New to the bestiary are the Gaudi, and they can put up a good fight if you don't attack them immediately. Not all of them are hostile though. Through this door, you'll arrive at a shop of all places. You can talk to some of these fellows here, and they reveal some interesting bits of lore about the Labyrinth. To begin with, this whole place was created by Yenka in order to keep the island's secrets safe. To make that possible, she confined the Gaudi inside of it, making them the guardians of the core, the sole reason why the island is allowed to float. By doing so, at the same time, she managed to help the Mimigas since they used to get eaten by these guys. That is a very good piece of world building. There is an entire ecosystem inside of this place, which you happen to have become a part of. Speaking of the protagonist, from one of these lads he learns that there is indeed a way to escape, however the exit is obstructed by a huge boulder. One last thing you can do inside the bar is talking to the shop owner. He was robbed not long ago, so he doesn't have anything to sell, but if you show him your polo star and a fireball, he can fuse them, creating the snake. I forgot to mention this earlier, but yeah, you can trade the polar star for various weapons across the journey. The first one you can obtain, however, is easily my favorite among all of them, and that is Curly's machine gun. You can get this as soon as you defeat her back at the sand zone, and man, this weapon is cracked. It takes a while to get to level 3, but once you do, you can literally fly. It also dishes out some great damage, everything's good about this thing. Oh, and in case you got to hear with the machine gun, the shop owner gives you the turbocharger instead, an item that increases the speed at which the machine gun's ammo recharges, making it Turbo Pugger certified. I love this thing so much. Well then, no matter the weapons you're carrying, you must now proceed deeper into the Labyrinth. Not too far from there though, Quote finds a clinic, and look who's there. Apparently, Misery attacked Curly soon after we left the bar. She tried to fight back, but fell in battle and got sent here, losing her children in the process. The doctor tells Quote that there is a way to help her, but for that, our mechanical fellow needs to bring back the old cure from the other clinic, which has been possessed by a ghost. Interestingly enough, the ghost looks a lot like Balrog. And oh yeah, this is also a boss fight. It's very cool how despite fighting some similar enemies across the story, every encounter feels unique. It's clear that Pixel put a ton of effort into making this. Speaking of Balrog, did you know that originally he was going to be the main villain of Cave Story? Long after the original freeware release, Amaya himself published some of his old sketches for what ended up being Cave Story. And man, this game went through quite a few phases. On one of them, interestingly enough, Balrog was a common enemy. The main character also went through a small change. He was originally named Curly Brace, but in the end that title was placed onto our blonde companion, with quote being the replacement, referencing the quotation marks often used in programming languages. That said, if I went over everything about the beta, we'd have a 3-hour video on our hands right now, so among the links I'll leave on the description, I'll drop you a few interesting pieces of info about it. Okay, with the old cure in our hands, we can take that to the doctor, and that means Curly is going to recover soon. Funnily enough, you see this chest up here? Normally, you can only get this later, but if you have the machine gun, you can propel yourself up there and grab the arms barrier early. This item helps the damage that your weapons receive after taking a hit, so it's pretty useful. The last few sections of the labyrinth bring back those blocks from earlier, now asking you to perform very precise jumps. Since this level is very linear, I can imagine it was easier to adjust the difficulty progression, and the results are quite solid. One thing I really enjoy though is the visuals of this place. The eye motif and the cramped corridors give this place a very different vibe, like you've been transported to a completely different world. That is reinforced by the brownish tones of the tiles and the green backgrounds, which is a color palette that no other place uses to this extent inside of the game. And on the topic of things I enjoy, there is the boss of this place. Quote will eventually reach this bizarre machine that seems to be stranded among the hordes of Gaudi. However, as you keep marching forward, boss music begins to play and whoa, hello there. This is Monster X, and he's the first opponent to have multiple phases. You'll begin by shooting these cores, which only open up when he comes to a stop. You gotta be careful though, since he will make sure to fight back, so you can just stand still and pull the trigger. Once you've damaged him enough, his main body will be exposed and you'll be able to actually hurt him. During the second phase, Monster X will start shooting homing missiles instead, which can be pretty hard to deal with, on top of having to dodge his incessant movements. It's certainly a very hectic fight, and thus pretty rough on your first go, but that doesn't mean that it's any less fun. In fact, if you make sure to take out the projectiles that he shoots at you, you'll be often rewarded with health pickups or missiles. Once you finally beat him, you can see that there was a cat piloting the machine all along, and that's pretty funny to me. I don't know, between the jumpscare entrance and how fun the entire fight is, this is certainly one of the many highlights of Cave's story, at least for me. With Monster X down, Quote arrives at the very end of the labyrinth, when suddenly... Wait, was that Professor Booster? I guess we should go and check up on him. Just like everyone else, he has been thrown in here by misery, which means that Mimiga Town has been attacked once more. Maybe there's a silver lining after all, he says, however. Booster reveals that, as we learned from the Gaudi, the island's core is inside here. If Quote is able to destroy it, the entire place will cease operations, putting an end to the Doctor's plans. With his last ounce of strength, the Professor hands over the Booster B08 to Quote, before passing away. Despite the cool new jetpack, holy cow, that's another ally that's been savagely killed by the Doctor. I told ya things were gonna keep getting tough. With this new trinket on his side, Quote rises once again with a newfound hope. And at the other side of the door, it's Curly. Seems like she found the exit short before us. If you recall, this is the boulder that marks the very end of the labyrinth, but unfortunately, it's too heavy for us to lift. Now, who will be the savior to aid our heroes on their escape? Of course. Technically, he's here for one last rematch, now at the maximum power. I must say, despite how many times Quote fights Balrog throughout the game, you can still notice a sense of progression with each encounter, since the giant toaster / soap bar will keep getting new tricks every time. After finally going down, not only does he help us to remove the boulder, but also he leaves the super missiles behind. Super Metroid reference! While not a new weapon, these powered-up missiles are very strong, and they've come at the perfect time because danger is rapidly approaching our duo of robotic fighters. But before that, it's time to have some fun. Heck yeah, time to bust down some of those darn cockroaches. Curly's finally fighting by our side, and this section of the labyrinth is ready to kick the pace into a higher gear. With tons of enemies and many obstacles that you can shoot down to replenish any resources, this entire area kinda feels like the game is giving you a breather after so many hardships and tragic events. From a gameplay standpoint, it also works perfectly, since it subverts everything that the player has been taught up to this point. Most of Cave Story's mechanics reward you for taking a strategic approach against every challenge, yet this last chunk of the labyrinth is the full opposite. You're encouraged to be more aggressive, not only by the constant barrage of enemies, but also because most platforming challenges here don't punish the player too much. It's like most setups are designed as a battle arena, instead of an obstacle course, and that's amazing for a quick shift in tone. Last but not least, I love how Curly is not here just to follow you, no, she's gonna blast those suckers down like there's no tomorrow. A detail I really appreciate is how, depending on your choices up to this point, she can either carry her own weapon, the machine gun, or Quote's old Polar Star. It gives the game a sense of continuity. That said, I hope you guys enjoyed the funny let's go bonkers area, because things are about to get less bright from now onward. Quote and Curly reach a dark area at the tail end of the labyrinth. This is the core, the mechanized heart that keeps the island afloat, high in the sky. Both heroes slowly inch their way through every barrier, and once inside, they find something very interesting. These are the scout robots that were sent to the island, or rather, what remains of them. As Curly points out, this amount of destruction is beyond the capabilities of a Mimiga, which means that whatever the mechanical soldiers found before their demise, it must be something very dangerous. Surprisingly, one of the robots is still barely functioning, coming back to life just to desperately call for a retreat. But before they can do that, the door behind them quickly shuts, and as their only company blows to pieces, the core itself comes to life. This is easily one of the toughest fights in the game, especially if you arrived here unprepared. The core will relentlessly shoot out projectiles at the player, only revealing its weak point during small fractions of time. The real game changer here is the presence of water. Up to this point, the level design has only used water as a small obstacle, often forcing you to perform long jumps. On this occasion though, the water can be pretty deadly. If the air meter reaches 0, Quote immediately dies. Thus, players are forced to stay at the top platforms to spend as little time as possible underwater. The core, however, will be here to prevent just that, which creates an extremely punishing, yet cleverly designed boss fight. Curly will also assist you here, after she recovers back from that little jump scare she had before. Once the core's health reaches 0, Misery will enter the scene, and she's not happy about what we just did. Fuming at the idea of the core being about to blow up, and in a desperate move, the Doctor himself decides to act, choosing to teleport the island's heart away from its chamber, just so he can fix it before the entire place comes crashing down. And with that, our hopes to stop the nefarious scientist have left the chat, only followed by the water rising up, submerging our heroes in the darkness. It's over. Or is it? At the very last minute, Curly gives Quote her air tank, allowing him to survive at the cost of her own life. The silent robot does make it count, quickly escaping the chamber before it's closed down for the last time. And it's here that you might realize that you are now alone. King and Toroko are long gone, Sue is nowhere to be found, and both Professor Booster and Curly sacrifice themselves to save you. That said, it's time to hurry and escape the labyrinth before something else comes our way. Quote does manage to exit the now flooded core, arriving at the Waterway. Now, considering what we've been through, this place feels surreal. The game keeps playing with the presence of water, now becoming a harmless element thanks to the air tank. And so this level is designed around water currents that you'll need to navigate while performing tight jumps and solving small puzzles. It's genuinely insane how, this late into the adventure, Cave Story is still throwing players into new situations. This amount of variety becomes even more impressive when you get reminded of how the entire game was a one-man project. And now that I bring that up, the boss at the very end of this area, Ironhead, comes straight from Mika-chan, one of Pixel's previous games. You can even see the protagonist of said game showing up after you defeat him. After that's done, Quote awakens at the Mimiga Village, which shows a very interesting parallel with how Sue arrived here for the first time, dropping down into the reservoir from above. Except, something's not right. Everyone is gone. Even the upbeat song that used to accompany this place has been replaced with the eeriness of quiet, a track whose name perfectly represents the state of the village. This very same piece will play if you try to visit any other NPC in the game, like Chaco or Santa. There is nobody here anymore. The only trace of life that's left is found inside of Arthur's house. In the computer screen, someone has left a few words typed into a document. Head for the egg corridor. Kazuma. Quote hops into the teleporter, and at the other side... Yeah, this place has seen better days. What used to be a level designed around the concept of warmth is now ravaged. Gone are the giant eggs, now replaced by the corpses of the dragons that were sleeping inside. And those few who survived are now aggressive, mindless monsters. Gameplay-wise, this revisit to the corridor barely feels like the same place once again, thanks to substantial changes to the terrain and the new enemies who inhabit the area. There's even an optional boss in the form of the twins. But, most importantly, the game has just turned its first level on its head. A simple yet engaging series of puzzles and platforming challenges has now become a brutal test of skill. Checkpoints are mostly gone, and instead of searching for upgrades, your mind will have to stay focused on learning about how to properly deal with every single obstacle that's gonna be thrown at you from now on. Once you make it to the tail end of the corridor, Quote finds the remains of egg number 0. Before he can check around the place, Kazuma emerges from the corner. Thankfully, he's alive and kicking, and he's been able to finally complete the hatching process. He explains that after Quote left for the Sand Zone, they tried to speed up their preparations to leave the island. That was until Misery attacked by surprise, teleporting Booster to the Labyrinth and kidnapping Sue. And so, Kazuma has given up. The Doctor's victory was certain since the moment he acquired the Demon Crown, he says. Thus, he's going to escape and leave everything behind before it's too late. He does offer Quote the option to join him aboard the flying creature. You can indeed accept his petition, causing the game to end prematurely. This awards you the bad ending, where Doctor succeeds in harnessing the power of the red flowers and attacks the Earth with an army of berserk Mimigas. But we are not here to give up, not after everyone has placed their hopes on us to put an end to this conflict. Quote rejects Kazuma's proposal, to which he replies, I see. You know, there is a way one might return the Mimigas to their natural state. You could destroy the island's core. And he's right. The Doctor teleported it away, so it must be under his watch now. If Quote can get there, there's still one chance to turn this around. And with a newfound determination, what follows suit is one of the most magical moments in the entire game. Just wow. This is the very first time you step outside of the island's cave system, and the game makes that extra special by utilizing an animated background, something that really sticks out against the solid backdrops we've seen thus far, and all accompanied by Moonsong, a piece that encapsulates the atmosphere of the starry sky, adding in the feeling of, this is our last chance, let's make it count. So, remember when I said that I would come back to rambling about the visuals and the soundtrack? Well, this is it. And that is because Cave Story's original soundtrack is more than just catchy tunes that resemble older times. No, this game is capable of creating an atmosphere through its sound. Visually speaking, Cave Story is capable of representing a wide variety of places, despite being limited to the theme of being inside of various underground areas. And a big part of that is how amazing some of the compositions are when it comes to setting up a scene. Let me give you an example. Pulse is the track that plays when you're inside of Egg Number Zero's chamber. As we've seen throughout the story, the dragon is a key element of the ongoing plot, and this darkened room is the place where our alliance with Sue is formed, as well as where our final decision is made. And to accompany those moments, Pixel went for a very atmospheric track. The song begins by using the drums to resemble the dragon's heartbeat, which then slowly evolves into the complete melody, with a melancholic synth taking the lead. This is a brilliant approach to properly set up the scene through the sound. But what's truly amazing is how this piece is designed to accompany two very different scenes without changing a single note. When you meet Sue, Pulse feels whimsical. After all, you're watching how your new friend explains how this dragon is their ticket to escape the island. A dragon that should be just a fairy tale, yet you can clearly listen to its heart beating. On the contrary, when you eventually come back here, the dragon is gone, leaving only the ex-shell behind. And that whimsical feeling is replaced by melancholy, as you listen to Kazuma giving in to his fear. This sense of duality is present across multiple pieces of the soundtrack, and it's genuinely impressive how deep its effect really is on the experience that Cave Story offers. Another good example happens inside the core, where geothermal creates a sense of mystery as Quote and Curly make their way to their supposed final destination. Yet, when you come out the door alone, after watching your companion sacrifice her life for you, it hits differently. This is why people often mention that Cave Story makes you feel things that very few games are capable of conveying, and it does while looking and sounding like a game from the late 80s. Now, going back to the Outer Wall, it's clear why this place is often the most well-remembered area in the entire game, and it's because the combination of everything leading up to this moment is masterfully crafted, leaving a palpable impact on their audience. That said, gameplay-wise, this is a very fun level too. The Outer Wall is solely focused on vertical progression, with enemies coming in from the right side of the screen to shoot you down with their projectiles. I like how this creates a sort of distinction between your side of the screen and the enemy area. So when you finally have to step away from that comfort zone, it feels like a daring move. The Outer Wall also brings back the crocs from the Sand Zone, now acting as small traps to force players into calculating their jumps with extra finesse. Eventually, you'll reach the top, finding a door to a small storehouse. Would you look at that? A new face! This is Aito, a human scientist that was cursed by misery, getting transformed into a Mimiga. Despite initially labeling Quote as a killer robot by force of habit, he is very friendly, and interestingly, calls our protagonist a savior. Now, with nothing else to do here, you can now proceed to the next door, thus arriving at the Plantation. Now, when the main theme of your game starts playing in the background, you know stuff is about to happen. The Plantation is a very open area, where the kidnapped Mimigas are being forced to work on growing those demonic red flowers. Oddly enough, all of them will refuse to talk to you, which seems very fishy, isn't it? If you explore north, you'll end up arriving at a jail, where a lot of the Mimigas are kept captive, and this is where you'll learn about what's really going on. The plantation workers have been deceived by the doctor. They think that a robot invasion is going to happen, just like 10 years ago, and only by using the red flowers can they become strong enough to defeat them. One small thing I like about this screen is the presence of this hidden teleporter here. When interacting with it, it says that the location is unknown, yet if you enter it, you end up in the shelter back at the Bushlands. So that means that this is the route that both Kazuma and Professor Booster used to escape earlier in the game. Gotta love some attention to detail. Back to the plantation, there are a few rooms you can check before making progress. First of all, there's this hidden passage here that leads to a shrine that contains the statues of those who have worn the crown in the past, with the Doctor being, of course, the most recent one. I do wonder, next is this other entrance that leads to the other jail. Inside of it you can see both Sue and Mahan, yet there is no way to interact with them, which might prompt you to look for something that may serve as a key. And turns out, if you explore the bottom part of the area, there's this one item here that you can't obtain, since it's covered by one of those insta-death spikes. What a tease, by the way! With those bits of information on our hands, the last area that remains unchecked is this room at the left corner of the map. Inside, there's a familiar face. Kampachi is going to take a break to fish, as usual, and if you follow him to the lake, he'll take the item for you. That item being a key to the teleporter room. While it's not exactly a way to liberate our fellow Mimigas, you can now at least go back to Arthur's house whenever you want. But then... I mean, we wanted to get to the other side of these bars, but not this way. Sue is gone too, leaving only Mahan behind. With quote, however, is a letter from Sue that she snuck into his pockets before being taken away by the Doctor's goons. It reads, "This is Sue. I don't believe I ever told you much about all of us. We came to this island from the surface on a research trip. Professor Booster was on our helicopter, and so was my mother, my brother, and various assistants, the Doctor as well. He was there to serve our medical needs, and did so, at least until he found the demon crown. That crown, once the property of a master of this island, grants monstrous magical powers upon its wearer. The Doctor knew this, even before coming to the island, which is why he wormed his way into our group in the first place. Once he had the demon crown in his possession, no one could stand up to him. We had no choice except to continue our research of the island under his orders. The Doctor seeks to rule the Earth's surface using this island as a base. I think he plans to first attack the surface using the Mimigas as weapons. Anyway, I was able to get away somehow, but I fear the other researchers are already... Now he's using the unsuspecting Mimigas to cultivate more and more red flowers. Once he's ready to attack, he will drive the Mimigas into a murderous frenzy using the flowers. Using his terrible powers, he will be able to control the raging Mimigas to do his bidding. And that means I, too, will. If you can escape from the sail, look for the hideout hidden in the plantation. If my mother is yet safe, she'll be there coming up with a counterplan. Please help my mother. The password is Litgano mod code." Alright, that shall be our next mission then. A pathway opens, allowing Quote to escape. Now, according to Sue, there's a secret hideout inside the plantation, which is found close to the center. You can even see it by using the map. The only obstacle being the fake wall you need to go through to finally reach that door. If you're playing on any version that uses the official localization, instead of Litgano mods code, the password will be Erots Evac, which is, of course, Cave Story backwards. Interestingly enough, the Eon Genesis password is also a wordplay on the game's title, except it uses the Japanese name Dokutsu Monogatari. In the original Japanese version, the password uses the same characters as the title, only scrambled. And this is what the Eon Genesis team attempted to translate, opting for romanizing the pronunciation of the original characters. Inside the hideout is Momorin Sakamoto, Sue's mother. She was told about Quote's arrival at some point earlier, so she's more than willing to help us to reach the Doctor's lair atop the island. For that, however, we'll need to bring her a few materials, so she can build a rocket that will help Quote to pierce through the defense system set by the Doctor. Taking our jetpack away for a brief moment, she hands our hero a Mimiga mask, allowing the player to talk to the Mimiga workers at the plantation. Now the first piece of the puzzle is a sprinkler, which you can get by taking a broken one from these Mimigas, exchange it for a new one, and then making your way back to the hideout. I can imagine they might be a little angry about it. Next is a controller that's in Naito's possession. Momorin describes him as a big coward, being the first one to run away from the doctor. Of course, we already know where he is, and once we get there, he hands it to us without any resistance, asking quote to give Momorin his regards. And with that, the rocket can be finally completed. Momorin does say, however, that it will take her some time to do so, telling quote to use this time as a chance to rest before the final battle. Once he wakes up, it turns out that Aito decided to help, finally gathering the courage to leave the room he was hiding in. You know your writing is good when you can create a meaningful character arc that lasts for about 20 minutes of playtime. Okay, this is it. The last stretch of our adventure. The last cave draws a parallel with the very beginning of our journey. A similar backdrop, yet the task is 10 times more brutal. You'll have to maneuver through countless spikes, beefed up enemies, and extremely tight jumps. While it may be a small difficulty spike if you come unprepared, I believe the level accomplishes its purpose very well, by testing the player's platforming skills in various ways, especially when it comes to putting that booster to good use. A fitting last test before reaching the very top. Over the last cave rests the balcony. This is the second and very last time we'll see the outsides of the island. The vibe here compared to the outer wall is very different, however. The only enemies here are some berserk Mimigas, similar to Igor. Otherwise, it's pretty empty, but I like how that makes it feel oddly tranquil. It's like the game's giving you a breather after the intensity of the last level. Yet, on the other hand, it feels uneasy. The doctor is just up ahead, so this tranquility is nothing but the calm before the storm. Up here you can find the helicopter that Momorin and her team used to arrive to the island, as well as a small shack that served as their base of operations, at least before the tragedy unfolded. Also, this is the last place where you'll be able to save the game. One small secret that's inside this area is how, right before the exit, if you're curious enough, you might notice that you can scale up the wall, and outside of the normal camera's view, there's this small area where you can replenish health, missiles, and weapon energy. And even better, if you keep going upwards, you'll find the top of the screen, with a sign that says, "That's all folks," which I find pretty funny. Okay, it's now or never. Time to put an end to the doctor's plans. As Quote steps into the throne room, he's welcomed by Misery. I like how if you pay close attention, you'll notice how this is the very same place you see whenever you put up the game, and that really makes sense now. Considering how close the helicopter is to this place, that doctor had everything planned perfectly. Speaking of the crown, we know Misery's fate is bound to its bearer, so she's definitely not gonna back down without a fight. This is the first proper encounter we've had with Misery herself, and she can be a tough cookie. She's a proper evolution of what most bosses have used against us so far, with various projectiles that require different approaches to properly avoid them. On the contrary, she's unique in the sense that her defenses will become stronger and stronger as the fight progresses. It's one of those fights that are likely to kick you on the rear until you fully grasp her attack patterns, but once you do, man is it fun. Once she's defeated, a staircase will appear near the edge of the screen, leading directly to the king's table, where Quote will finally stand face to face with that lab coat wearing Mother Buzzer. He has a new toy, however. Since the last time we saw him, thanks to the work of the enslaved Mimigas, he's been able to finally harness the essence of the red flowers, giving birth to the Earth Crystal, a relic that allows him to force the same effect as the accursed flowers upon the Mimigas, and now it even works on humans. And in fact, he's going to showcase its terrifying powers by using it on himself. Ready or not, the final battle begins. Unlike Misery, the Doctor is a very different opponent compared to anything we've seen up to this point. For starters, he's a bit of a coward, constantly teleporting around the battlefield while throwing projectiles, often from off-screen. His only other move is a screen nuke attack that is pretty tough to dodge, requiring some good positioning. The fight is a bit like a game of tag. You'll be constantly chasing the Doctor while trying to sneak in some shots whenever the red crystal isn't blocking your way. It can be a bit nerve-wracking, but honestly, I think that was the intention. After all, such devilish tricks are fitting for an asshat of his caliber. That said, it's a very fair boss battle. In fact, you can predict where he's going to spawn by looking at where the crystal itself is going. Although once Quote takes him to his limit, something unexpected happens. His usual smug grin suddenly turns into an expression of fear, as he realizes that his own creation is going out of control. As he himself bragged about earlier, the crystal is able to disable one's reasoning, and so he goes completely insane, turning into a jacked up monster. His fancy tactics are also gone, with his only attacks now being a desperate tackle. The second phase is substantially easier than the last one, so it's more like a playable cutscene, which is something I can appreciate. Get his life bar to 0, and the Doctor will dissolve into tiny pieces along with the crystal itself. But then, another staircase appears. Maybe at the top we shall find the core once and for all. Mind you, if you kick the bucket at any point during the finale, you'll have to fight both Misery and the Doctor once again, since if you remember, the last checkpoint is located back at the prefab building. Thankfully, there is a small secret way of recovering your health past this point. Around the King's table, you'll recognize some familiar faces trapped behind the bars. Yep, those are Santa and Chaco from the Bushlands. And by interacting with the latter, she'll tell Quote that seeing him reminds her of the legendary Arthur. By just the mere mention of their beloved knight, the Mimigas will be moved by those memories, and they will give you hearts to recover your health. I'll say it again, this game is filled to the brim with these kinds of details, and more often than not, they will put a smile on your face. Now into the black space we go, the final room. Here's where the core is located, but Misery is not going to let us take the island down without resistance. She immediately teleports Sue to the scene, threatening to kill her if we dare pull the trigger on our polar star. Before the tension can be properly resolved, someone comes back. The Doctor is alive, now existing as a supernatural entity, having completely fused with the essence of the red crystal. He turns Misery and Sue into berserk monsters, takes control of the core, and now the real final battle begins. The fight against Undead Core is a fantastic test of everything that Cave Story has been aiming to teach you on a mechanical level. Just like the original Core, you'll only be allowed to shoot when the Doctor's maniacal face is exposed. Thus, learning about enemy patterns and being patient is the key to victory. The game enforces this thanks to the other two elements of the fight, those being Sue and Misery, now in their enraged forms. Sue is the more offensive of the two, charging at the player at consistent intervals, which means you need to keep an eye on her at all times. On the opposite side of the spectrum, Misery will stay idle besides the Doctor. If you're impatient and shoot the core while it's invincible, it's very likely that you'll hit her instead, and that will make her summon enemies into the battle. As for the Doctor himself, he uses some very devastating attacks that you can differentiate by looking at his face. The freakier it gets, the stronger the move will be. When combined, all of these elements make for a very challenging final fight, the perfect grand finale for a game with such quality as Cave Story. And best of all, you have this freaking masterpiece playing on the background. Fun fact, Pixel has said that he's not particularly a musician, and that his compositions share a more functional purpose, which sounds completely insane when you look at the stuff he made for this game. Now back on track, you can defeat both Sue and Misery to take them out of the fight, but one thing I always do is try to keep them alive during the battle. It makes it a little bit more difficult, yet extra rewarding. Now, once you finally put the final bullet onto the Doctor's hideous face, the battle is over. And, along the destruction of the core, the Mimigas are finally returned to their normal state, that including Sue. With Misery seemingly gone, the surviving duo quickly runs towards the exit, as the island begins to crumble. Thankfully for us, Momori and Naito manage to make their way to the balcony, and their good old helicopter still works. While trying to escape, and with giant pieces of the island raining upon them, Quote and Sue find themselves cornered. The helicopter can't get close, and time is running out. So they decide to jump from the tip of the island and hope to survive the landing. And then we see familiar places of our journey, as they are slowly destroyed by a dying island, along with their still living fauna and flora. just before the island crashes down into the land below. We then cut to Quote, who's seemingly about to meet the same fate. However, at the very last minute, phew, that was close. With the collapse of the island, Kazuma says that the Doctor's creations should be gone along with him, which means that the calamity has been averted and peace will surely come back soon. And with that, the credits roll. Despite the successful escape of our protagonists, the ending to Cave's story is not a happy one at all. Sure, a massive catastrophe has been prevented, yet it feels empty. Empty because of the amount of friends, allies and innocent lives lost along the way. The story of Pixel's magnum opus is one of its most appreciated aspects, and for good reason. A normal playthrough of Cave's story takes around 4 to 5 hours, yet in that small time span, these characters grow on you. And they do so because not only are they charming in their own ways, but because they are very well written and presented to you through the game. And I think the perfect example of that is Quote himself. Silent protagonists are very hard to do right, because more often than not, you'll end up with a blank slate designed only as an avatar for the player, a self-insert if you will. Yet, Quote works well as a character inside the lore, while still letting you influence his actions in a meaningful manner. If you pay close attention to how other characters perceive him, you can get a clear picture of who he is. Quote is a fellow that prefers actions over words, a combat robot with a kind heart and a stubborn head. As an example, while retrieving Jenga's puppies, by the time you already have the 4th one, she straight up tells you that you won't get the key to the warehouse. Yet you still have to go ahead and bring her back the last puppy. Why? Because she is too old to retrieve them by herself. That compassionate personality is also why you will do things like retrieving Santa's key, helping Sue, or pulling Malco back to his original state. While you can decide over some of his actions along the story, these specific ones are forced upon the player. Thus, the decision to help these people is not in your hands, but on Quote's. From my experience, early on, you will feel that the game is taking you somewhere, like you're going through a forced main event of the plot. But as I made progress, these actions didn't happen because I felt like I had to do them, more so that I felt like that's what my character would do. And it's so effective because, essentially, you as a player and Quote as your avatar start the journey in the exact same way, without any information of who or where you are, just to get thrown into an unknown conflict that will help you discover more about your surroundings and your past. That is why I believe it's so easy to relate to him. This amount of care is equally divided into every single main character that appears throughout the story, be it villain, ally or side character. And if you combine a cast this well thought out with a mature story filled with many twists and turns, what you get is an engaging plot that will keep you hooked from beginning to end. However, this ending we just got still leaves a few questions unanswered, like what happened to Misery and the crown? What was that bizarre area with all the statues all about? And, most importantly, why were Quote and Curly sent to the island in the first place, along with the other robots? Well, if you're familiar with Cave's story, you might already know this, but this is not the true ending, and to properly watch that, we're gonna have to work a little harder. The route to the true ending of Cave's story is probably one of the most criticized portions of the full experience, mainly because of the multiple steps that are required to even be allowed to achieve it, some of those being very specific. While it's clear that this ending is not meant to be achieved on the first playthrough, some of the clues are pretty hard to find anyways. And the main reason why I say this is because one of those requirements is infamous for going against what I've just discussed about Quote. So, going back to the Labyrinth chapter, remember that one part where Professor Booster falls into a pit? Well, this room is vital to achieve the best ending. While it may seem impossible at first, you can get to the other side of the corridor without having to take the booster item. The jump is very tight and you only get one chance to make it, so I'm very thankful that Pixel placed a save point right here. The problem is not performing the jump itself, however. It's the fact that you need to purposefully ignore Professor Booster here, which is the full opposite of what most players will do after watching him plummet into the pit. There is an in-game hint for this, all things considered. If you check the prefab building, over at the balcony, you can find Booster's journal, which reads, "Further investigation of the island is feasible if a device to aid with airborne mobility is available. For this, I will begin development of the booster rocket. Development of this aerial device will have multiple phases, with 2 booster versions, B08 and B2.0. The plan is to make version 0.8 to be equipped and permit some form of aerial propulsion. And as long as I can survive, B2.0 will also be completed, it being even more indispensable, as long as I don't die." As misleading as it may sound, the key part of the message is as long as I don't die. By interacting with Booster, he dies right in front of your eyes, so it's implied that the solution is to try and avoid talking to him. That way, he presumably uses the rocket to make his way to the teleporter below, thus saving his life. If you have successfully done so, the rest of the requirements for the 2 ending will be activated, thus allowing you to make progress on the secret questline. By doing so, once you enter the core's chamber, you might notice a small sparky thingy here. Take a closer look, and it's a tow rope. With this, you can do the following. Did you know that the woman named Jenka had a younger brother? His name was Ballos. Yep, you can indeed take Curly with you, in search of a way to save her from drowning. Remember when I told you how the soundtrack can make you feel in different ways despite using just one piece of music? Well, the Waterway also applies to that criteria. I kid you not, the first time I figured out how to save our blonde fellow, this play suddenly had a completely different tone. You are no longer letting the water carry you after a total defeat. Now you have survived to fight another day, but helping your crewmate is the main priority. From here on out, missing any of the following steps will break apart your chances of that true ending. So yeah, it's not an easy task. Next up, you gotta take Curly to this pretty hard to reach cabin, found at the very end of the Waterway. Here you can drain the water from her circuits, thus saving her life. Now this is the part that I always have to remind myself to not screw up. Once she's safe, you have to choose not to leave Curly here and take her with you. Now that I really think about it, it kinda makes sense to do so, since the air tank will keep both characters safe, but my logic on my first playthrough of the game was more like, I gotta let her rest here and she'll probably reboot on her own. I don't know, don't judge me. From there, complete the fight against Ironhead as usual, and you'll see how the tow rope lets go, separating you from your partner. Here's where your big reward for not speaking to Professor Booster earlier comes into play. The moment you step into Arthur's house, he'll suddenly enter the scene and give you the booster rocket B2.0, allowing you to dash in all 4 directions instead of the short hover of the previous version. And speaking of the booster rocket, now that we are into turbo spoiler territory, I can finally tell you about the 2 secret weapons that you can get your hands on at this point of the game. At the very top of Mimiga Village, you can find your way back into the first cave. If you then return to Hermit Gumsmith's workshop, and only if you've been keeping your Polar Star up until this point, he'll let you know that you took his weapon before it was properly finished. Despite being a bit angry at first, he's happy that Quote took care of his creation very well, and he will take the time to finally unleash its full power. In that way, the Polar Star will now take a new shape, transforming into the Spur. This weapon is purposefully designed to be way stronger than any other tool at your disposal. Unlike every other weapon, the Spur doesn't require experience to level up. Instead, you can charge up to 3 levels by holding down the fire button, to then unleash a devastating blast. That also means that no matter how much damage you take, there will be no consequences at all. The other cool weapon you can find is a bit easier to get, but still a very interesting one. You might have noticed how below the entrance to the outer wall, there's a thin platform you can cross with careful jumping. This is the Little House, where a family of very small people live. The lady will ask you to find her husband, since he has not arrived from work at the usual time. Now, if you pay very close attention to the floor here at the Mimiga Cemetery, you might spot a small chunk of pixels strolling around behind the grass. Interact with him, and he'll agree to travel in our pocket so we can take him home. Now, if you do so, the little man will ask you to trade King's Blade for the Nemesis, the second secret weapon of the game. This one is pretty funny, because it's the only weapon that becomes weaker the more you upgrade it. At level 1, it will fire powerful energy blasts. But at level 3, it will shoot rubber duckies instead. I told ya this game had a nice sense of humor. Needless to say, these two weapons make for a fun pair of side quests that add an extra layer of replayability to Cape's story. Especially the Spur, since you need to purposefully keep your Polar Star through a big chunk of the main game, thus skipping on some of the trades. Now back to the two ending quest. Once you eventually reach the Plantation, Curly will be sitting on a bed next to the Cthulhu fellow, having lost her memories. Thankfully, there is a way to help her. Green Hoodie here mentions the existence of a special type of mushroom that's capable of restoring one's memories with just one bite. Mushrooms, huh? Well, we know a place where those guys have been growing for a while now. Our target is up here, however. Meet Mapignon, a very egocentric mushroom who doesn't seem to be willing to help us at first. If Quote keeps insisting though, he'll hand over the mushroom badge, the key to save our... you pesky fungus. Oh well, we'll have to do this the other way around. Mapignon can be quite tricky to deal with, since he's immune to both your missile launcher and the blade for no apparent reason, and he can hit you for some funky damage values. After he gets properly humbled, you can take the mushroom with you and feed it to Curly. And what follows is a pretty big reveal. 10 years ago, a squadron of combat robots was sent to the Flying Island with only one directive: to retrieve the Demon Crown, the almighty power hidden atop the floating continent. Quote and Curly, on the contrary, were not a part of that team. They were sent instead by a different person, on a mission to destroy the crown before anyone could get their hands on it. When they arrived, the island was a battlefield. Despite their efforts, Quote and Curly were too late, and the Demon Crown fell on the hands of a man. In just a moment, he took control of the surviving Mimigas, turning them into beasts, and sending them down into the surface. The robot duo tried their best to fight the new bearer of the crown. But, despite being able to injure him, the battle was lost. That's where the memories end, she says. So, that sheds light on top of one of the game's biggest mysteries. Now we know how Quote lost his memories, and why he was stranded inside the first cave. To make this encounter unforgettable, Curly hands our protagonist the Iron Bond, a sign of their unbreakable connection. Once this item is in Quote's inventory, the last obstacle that's between you and the true ending will be finally cleared. The only thing that's left for us to do is to make our way to the balcony. The last cave, on the other hand, has a nice surprise for us. This secret version of the stage will only appear if the Booster Rocket 2.0 is in your possession. And it's mostly the same as the normal version, except you'll start with all your weapons at level 1, and there will now be a special boss fight against the Red Ogre, who behaves similarly to the sculpture enemies found at the Plantation. From here, everything proceeds as usual. Quote makes his way to the balcony, fights Misery, the Doctor and the Undead Core, and then the island begins to crumble. However, if you have acquired the Iron Bond and the Booster 2.0, if you enter the prefab building on your way out, you'll notice something has changed. Just like when you enter the hidden last cave, your weapons will be sent back to level 1, as Quote approaches the very last area of the game. This is the Bloodstained Sanctuary, or as the game calls it, Hell. Up to this point, Cape's story has been a mostly well-balanced game in terms of difficulty, with every area amping up the challenge without getting far enough so that any player can't beat the main game. The Sanctuary, on the other hand, being the secret final level, says screw those rules, baby. When the very first screen of a stage looks like a Kaizo ROM hack, you know you're in for a treat. Bloodstained Sanctuary is divided into 4 sections, with the third one being the longest. You'll pick up Curly after the initial drop, and while she'll be asleep as you book it towards the exit of the second section, the moment you enter Hell's third block, she'll be ready to guard your back. She even carries the Nemesis now. Something noteworthy about Hale here is how it feels different to any other area of the island, with its angelical monsters and golden shutter blocks. Yet it resembles the Labyrinth, the other place that's connected to Jenka and Ballos. These two are the most unexplored parts of Cave Story's lore thus far, and the Sanctuary is here to change that. At certain points of the stage, something will try to communicate with you, delivering the full story of Ballos and the origins of the island. Long ago, humans inhabited this very same land. Both Ballos and Jenka were special in the sense that they wielded magical powers that no other human possessed. However, as powerful as he was, Ballos only used his abilities to help and guide people, and that turned him into a very beloved figure among the kingdom. Everything changed though when Ballos' name made its way to the king, who grew incredibly jealous of him. His decision then was to imprison and punish Ballos in the most cruel of ways. That was until Ballos, weakened by the torture, finally snapped. Consumed by rage, he let his powers run wild, reducing not only the king, but the entire land to ashes. Despite the destruction he caused, Jenka couldn't bring herself to kill her own brother, and so she decided to confine him inside this very same sanctuary, and then use her magical powers to raise the land to the skies, thus keeping him away from human society. Since then, Ballos has been trying to crash the island into the ground below, which is why the core is the key to keeping the continent afloat. As for the Demon Crown, years after the incident, Jenka's daughter, Misery, tried to approach Ballos. She convinced them to create the Demon Crown, an artifact imbued with his almighty powers. However, Ballos bestowed the curse upon Misery, giving the crown's bearer the power to control her and Balrog. And since this crown is tied to Ballos' powers, the only way to truly get rid of it is to put an end to the source of that magic. While the execution of this last story bit is not perfect, I think I'm not the only one who ran into trouble just because of getting jump scared by a text box. I believe it's very cool how the game has been teasing us all along with small pieces of information about the nature of this island, but only now, once you've conquered everything else, is when you get the complete picture of what happened. It's a very nice way to reward you for getting here in the first place. And good thing they do, because conquering the sanctuary is a brutal task. Thing is, you have to complete those 4 sections back to back and without any checkpoints. If you kick the bucket, you gotta start over from scratch, no matter how far you make it into the dungeon. Thankfully, Pixel designed this place in a very smart way. The most insane pieces of platforming are located at the very beginning of the area, followed by the long corridor with the falling blocks, and into the 3rd section. From there, all of the enemy setups and platforming challenges you'll find are all based around careful positioning and thoughtful decisions. That means that, as long as you know what you're doing, you should have a consistent shot at beating the level. Thing is, by locating such a brutal test at the early sections of the level, you're gonna have that extra bit of tension as you go deeper and deeper into the sanctuary. Because every time you mess up, you gotta face the spikes once again. It demands you nerves of steel, and it does so without ever crossing the line of fair game design. Once you're through the 3rd area, you'll have to engage in 2 different boss fights back to back. First one is a massive version of those press enemies, which makes for a hectic yet short encounter. And then, once you dive down the hole left by the monster, you end up inside of that one room of the Plantation. That door that used to be out of reach is now accessible, but if you enter the room with the statues, you can find a cool Easter egg. By shooting them, not only will you obtain some nifty power-ups, but they will transform into statues of King, Taroko, Curly, and Quote. Now through the door you'll reach the corridor, leading into a chamber where Ballos was sealed in. Here you'll meet the voice that's been talking to us for the entire stage, taking the shape of a dog, who urges our duo of robots to destroy Ballos before it's too late. Small interruption, you see this spike right here? It's one of those insta-death hazards, and it's here to troll impatient players. Very devilish from Pixel, though it's kinda funny when someone falls for it. There he is, our actual final boss. Ballos is not the most complex boss fight in the game, but he's definitely the toughest. Every single one of his moves is perfectly telegraphed, so once you finally observed how he works, it becomes a hectic dance that looks great on gameplay and feels sick as a player. Once it goes down, it's done. Roll the credits. Or maybe not. Yeah, Balos has a total of 4 different phases. Each of them requires something very specific from the player. You'll begin by shooting his eyes, while dodging his constant ground pounds, and also being hounded by countless enemies above. Once that health bar goes down, last battle will kick in, and our giant face fellow will start throwing us some really crazy stuff. On my first playthrough, I died countless times at this part of the final fight, just because I didn't realize it was all about positioning yourself between each of Balos' orbs here. The moment that barrier is out of the picture, things will get pretty hectic. Flying enemies, rocks, moving platforms, all at once. Design-wise, it's clear that there was a ton of effort put into this final encounter. I especially like how every phase is like a final test for every single thing that Cave Story has been asking you for the duration of your adventure. Quick reflexes, good aim, careful positioning, and the capacity of performing well under pressure. It's the cherry on top of Cave Story. With Balos dead, the island's fall quickly comes to a halt. But before Quote and Curly can rejoice in their victory, our evil magician still has one trick up his sleeve. That was indeed very close. Now that everything's safe, Quote, Curly and Balrog will be able to spend the rest of their days living peacefully, knowing that the island's inhabitants are safe and that the demon crown will never return. Same goes for the Sakamoto family, who managed to escape the island, just like in the normal ending. So, yeah, that was it. I suppose I should start wrapping up this video too. It's been a long journey, so thank you for staying up to this point. Now let's sum everything up before we leave. Cave Story, as you may know, would go on to be a massive hit worldwide, and it's very clear to see why. Its lovable characters, fantastic storytelling, great level design, and impeccable presentation makes for an absolutely unique experience. All of this is elevated by the fact that only one fellow was behind its creation. However, despite its limitations and the gargantuan task of building a video game only by himself, Pixel did it. The impact of this game on the industry is genuinely impossible to measure on numbers or words. Thanks to being so quickly translated into English, it meant that literally anyone who had a PC at home and knew either English or Japanese could enjoy Cave Story. Sure, the initial shock of its release wasn't as explosive as things are nowadays on the internet, but I kid you not, this game changed video games forever. But the thing is, it didn't change the concept of games by itself. Design-wise, Cave Story is an extremely polished title that follows the design conventions of the 90s and 80s, which will still be nostalgic for many players. The reason why Cave Story is so important, it's because it should have been impossible. Games like these require an entire team of people, yet Pixel was able to do it entirely on his own. His breakthrough meant that indie gaming was indeed possible, and that deeply resonated with all of those teens or adults who dreamed of making video games, no matter if their place on the world was far away from the big studios who stood at the top of the industry. As you may know, Cave Story will be released in multiple shapes and forms, yet a sequel never happened. In fact, Pixel has said in various interviews that he doesn't have plans on ever doing one. That said, like a wise man once said, don't cry because it's over, smile because it happened. And oh boy, am I glad it happened. Since 04, we've seen countless indie developers trying to add something new to the table, and along the way, amazing video games have managed to get under the spotlight. Many of those still carry a little bit of Cave Story on their DNA, be it on their characters, mechanics, or just as a reference. This has been the story of how a small game and its only creator managed to bring video games into a new realm. The journey of an amnesiac robot through a floating island, carrying a strong message through its intricately written dialogue. So here's to another 20 years of that story. May your legacy never fade. And to conclude, thank you, Cave Story. And thank you for watching. My name is BurnCrowSP, and I shall see you soon.